Hi everyone, welcome to the podcast. I'm Benedek and I'm going to be your host. I'm a founder of an education technology company, a medical student, and most importantly, a learning science geek myself. Today we are diving deep into a topic that sits at the bottom of the heart of every educator and administrator who are thinking about driving real educational impact. How to bring effective evidence-based learning strategies into real-life classroom experiences. And to help us do that, I'm incredibly excited to be joined by Dr. Veronica, a cognitive learning scientist whose work bridges the gap between educational research and practical classroom implementation. Today, her research is on the cognitive underpinnings of learning and instruction like memory and metacognition, but focusing on the social, psychological aspects as well, like mindset and motivation. And what's most important is that she's doing that with a clear focus on direct applications to classroom, online instruction, and self-regulated learning. Lately, she has put a lot of focus on interleaving practice, which to me honestly was the most interesting part of our conversation. Veronica also shares how to design more effective assessments and how to bring these methodologies into your class time rather than assigning them as homework to get the most out of the limited instructional time you have. So if you're an educator, an instructional designer, curriculum designer, school leader, admin, student, learning scientist, this episode is for you. You will learn about these amazing learning methodologies and how to put them into practice to change the way you teach or you learn from tomorrow. So without further ado, let's get into it. Hi Veronica, how are you? Welcome to the
I'm
podcast.
great. I'm great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Uh, Honestly, when we met in Austin, the ad hoc meeting that I invited you to, I was just amazed by your amazing research and how well you go into like actually putting the research that you do into practice and how you really focus on that. So I'm extremely excited to have you here. And without further ado, I think let's get into today's episode. The first things that I would just like to start things off with is how did you got into learning science and what made you so passionate about these problems and these ideas?
So that's such an interesting question for me as a memory researcher. So I consider myself a memory researcher at my core, and then the lens that which I study memory through which I study memory is really about how we apply it to education. But when people ask me about how I got into learning science, that's asking me about my memories of how I got there. And the real funny thing about memory, all memories, including the stories that we tell about our own lives, is that it's all reconstructed. Of course, we remember different beats of what happened to us, but the way in which we think back, we structure it into a narrative and think about how do we get here. Um, it's very much um, constructed in the moment or based on previous retellings. So so I'll have different stories for how I think I got to where I am. One story is that I was always a pretty good student. My parents really drilled the value of education into me from a very, very young age. And so, one of the things that I did a lot as a kid was I tutored other students and I tutored my classmates, I tutored my friends. It was something that I was always interested in, is thinking about how we learn. And because I had always done pretty well in school, I thought that I had somehow magically stumbled into the right way to learn, that if I found some way to make learning really easy. And then I went to graduate school to think about how we can improve learning. And then I sat in those lab meetings for the first few months, getting kind of confused, really, because what I was hearing in those lab meetings was something totally different from what I had been telling myself. That rather than make learning easy, we should be making learning more difficult, more effortful. That's one of the stories I can tell. And it seems like a very straightforward story. Another story I could tell is that I kept a lot of diaries, journals when I was a kid. So I would constantly write about the things that happened in my own life. And so my sense of identity was very much based on the things that I wrote, how I interpreted my experiences, how I remembered my experiences. And as a kid, and until you study psychology, you really think that your memories are one of the big things in your life that you can trust. Right? You can trust the things that you see through your eyes, and you can trust the things that you experience and you remember in your head. And I sat in psychology class in high school just because I was interested in understanding human behavior, and I remember listening and learning about the malleability of memory. So I learned about Elizabeth Loftus's series, a classic series of studies of how our memories can incorporate false information that is suggested to us afterwards. I learned about the ways in which we are prompted with questions can shift what parts of our memories we recall, and that can go and reshape things. So there's another one version of my stories that I tell is that because I was so diary focused, memory focused about my own life, that to learn about the malleability of memory really shook me to my core. And that was the thing that fascinated and grabbed me. And that's the reason why I chose memory.
That's
But,
super.
yeah.
Uh,
But of course, there are other stories I could have told if I had chosen a different path, right? There's another version of me where I was the good Asian kid who became a pediatrician, or the good Asian kid who became a lawyer, but that didn't happen, so those aren't the stories that I tell.
yeah, that's really interesting to see that you know, I could really resonate with that because I was always like a good student, especially like up until university when, if you're like kind of smart, you basically get through and you don't face those big challenges. So I'm really interested, like, what are the methods that you thought worked for you and then you found this easy way to learn? Uh, and what are the methods that you then teach to others, different to how you started?
So back then, I was all about quantity over quality. So if you think about different educational models or education philosophies, um, in a lot of Eastern countries, it's really about put a lot of time in. You
Mhm.
just keep doing it. And I was, the good first daughter of Asian parents who would just put her head down and just study, 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 study. It was massive amounts of study. And my brother, who's 5 years younger than me, I remember um, in our household, I was the good Asian daughter, and he was the why why are you playing so many computer games? Why are you out there playing with your friends? Why aren't you studying more like your sister? But and so there was that feeling that I was the good student and he was very smart and he got good grades, but he did it with the least possible effort, like the minimal effort he needed to get his straight A's. Um, and back then I thought, oh, like I'm doing the right thing. I'm the one who's getting the kudos from my parents just for putting lots of time in. But I was also very, very stressed out. There were other things in my life that I didn't develop, other interests that I didn't develop that my brother really did. My brother, I would say, he learned how to optimize his time and be more efficient with it and could therefore fit more into his life. So, what my focus really is now is how do we not encourage study in a way that looks just like studying a lot? Because that's, I think, oftentimes the message. Oh, if you're not doing well enough, you need to study harder. What my philosophy now and the things that I'm trying to do with my research is how do we get people to study smarter? Because time is always going to be your limiting variable. You
Mhm.
only ever have 24 hours a day, and we're supposed to be sleeping for a third of it. And then there are other things that are important in our lives. So my work now is how do we think about getting people not to study harder, but to study smarter and to then free the rest of their time up for doing other things and having fuller lives.
Yeah, that's so. First of all, what has got to my head immediately is when you said optimize or study less, but with more quality. But how do we test what you know? Like, what is the assessment in that? Because it could be like an exam, but that does not really resonate how well because you could just cram like I don't know, a couple of days for that. So, what is the method to assess the knowledge that you gain and what by quality of knowledge or long-term retention or how do you think about that problem?
That's a great question. What I loved that I heard you say that I oftentimes don't hear people say is exams are not a great measure of learning. And I think every teacher understands that, and yet our school systems are so focused on exam performance. So every teacher knows that I can have a student who does really well, and then after the exam, when we move on to the next unit, or the next year when there's a follow-up course, just because they did well on the exam, the previous unit, the previous course, doesn't mean they've retained any of it. So absolutely, exam performance, I think we have to really think about, there's a difference between in the moment performance, and you can get good exam performance either by learning something really deeply or by cramming for it and learning it shallowly, or learning it for a very short period of time, just enough so it covers the exam.
Yeah.
So in the lab, in the cognitive psychology research, one of the things that we do to study more efficient, effective learning is oftentimes studies make sure that whatever other strategies we're comparing are always the same amount of time. So between condition A and condition B, we think that one strategy is probably going to be more effective. We want to make sure that when we're comparing A and B, we're not comparing different amounts of time. So immediately built into the research, there's already that efficiency component, which is given the same amount of time, in which way can you get more out of it? Then there are other ways that we can try to examine learning as opposed to just in the moment short-term performance. So one thing that we do is we also try to create experiments in which we have delayed tests. So it's not immediately after initial study, but that there's some period of time where we allow that information to move away from the forefront of people's mind, either with a distractor task, or maybe we come back on a different day, a week later, a month later, and then we can look at what are the results for how people learn. The other thing that researchers do is that they also look beyond just pure memory and look at transfer of learning or application of learning. Is this learning now usable in a slightly different format than the way it was absorbed in? Because really,
Are
that's what we want.
exactly, and are the ways you measure knowledge, so delay test or application transfer of knowledge, are those the parameter that does not change usually in research, or do you also change the way you measure knowledge? Because I assume if you had like a secret way of measuring knowledge, then the research the bigger innovation would happen on how do we actually help students study for those measurements. Or do you also change the measurement style in your research?
So, across different experiments, people might choose to do different things. I would say the vast majority of experiments do still look at a lot of conceptual learning, but also memory and factual learning. We often try to create exams that are going to be relevant to people's school lives.
Mm.
And also, we need to create assessments that can be relatively objectively scored, because if they become subjective, then we don't know
Yeah.
if what the result is, if the result is because of the way we scored it or because it's, we want to make sure it's something that's not arguable. And so when we try to think about, well, the goal of our education is for learning to be useful in people's real lives, the problem is we don't exactly know when that's going to come up or how that's going to come up. And it becomes very hard to capture systematically.
Hmm.
So there is a bit of a gap, but we hope that by making sure things are delayed, that making sure things are more applied or conceptual, looking even in these like smaller ways, that will give us really important insights into then the bigger ways that these
Mhm.
strategies can help us in our daily lives.
Makes a lot of sense. Maybe moving on from your methodologies and how you thought studying should be done. As we move on, can you tell me, like, based on your experience, I know this, learning methodology and learning techniques field is a bit sometimes all over the place, or there are people who like have learning styles and stuff. What are the real methods that you do believe actually work and have been proven to work?
Yeah, so learning scientists are not a monolith, right? So as you said, there are lots of different things out there, and people might talk about different strategies or focus on different techniques. There's one that that all learning scientists agree on, is that individual learning styles is a myth, that there is no evidence that if you think that you're a visual learner, you'll learn better visually. You think that you're an auditory learner, you'll learn better auditorily. So one of the biggest myths in education, that's one place where I think we'll all agree on. And then you ask about what are then the strategies that work. As well as a lot of my colleagues, we tend to think about three big ones: retrieval practice or active recall, distributed or space practice, and interleave practice. Those would be what I would consider the big three. So let me go through each one. So starting with, I'm going to start from the place where I'm going to say that learning is generally not one and done. Now, there are some exceptions. Food poisoning might be an example where you have the one experience and you remember that and you decide, I'm never going to eat shrimp again. But in general, the things that we need to learn, the knowledge and skills that we need in our lives, it's not a one and done scenario. These things have to be repeated. The things that keep coming up in our lives, our brain remembers as, oh, this is actually going to be something that's important for me. That if it's something that comes up multiple times in different ways across time. So learning is not one and done. It has to be repeated, but how those repetitions are distributed really matters. Because if those repetitions are just read it over and over and over again in a short period of time, in the literature we refer to that as massing, or from a student perspective, you might call that cramming. That's actually not going to be nearly as good for your long-term retention. So if you cram something 5 times in a row, back to back, that's not going to be good as spreading those 5 repetitions out in time. So that's the first piece, is that one of the most robust findings from the cognitive literature is that spacing out that practice is really effective. Spacing out repetitions is really effective for learning. Now, what you do when you repeat something also matters. So that brings me to the second thing, which is retrieval practice. That when you come back to something over and over again, that if you were just reading it or listening about it and being generally very passive about it, yes, that exposure is going to help you, but it's going to be even more effective if in that each repetition, you're putting active effort into trying to recall, trying to organize, trying to retrieve that knowledge for yourself before then you get feedback. So if we think about what this means in the classroom, oftentimes a lecture happens just once and you move on. That's not great for learning. We have to come back to it. And built into education, well, there are a lot of repetitions, right? So maybe you have the lecture and then you have homework. And that means that you're exposed to the material a couple of times, maybe with a few days or a week in between. And then that second time, because it's homework, you're being active in retrieving it. But just those 2 times is not enough. And to wait for the third time to be all the way at the end of the semester when people are studying for the exam, that's also too far away. What you want is you want to be doing more frequent repetitions so that by the time you get to that final exam, you've had multiple opportunities to practice retrieving it.
Do you have a magic number there?
How many times? There's not really a magic number. That so much depends on what it is that you're learning, the complexity of it, how much it is getting integrated with your prior knowledge. It also depends on how you're integrating, the strength of your prior knowledge and how you're integrating it there. And also how long you want to keep it for. The more you want to keep it for, in general, the longer spacing you're going to need between repetitions.
Can you say that having, let's say, instead of learning it once at the lecture, or like getting exposed to the information at the lecture and then learning it for the exam, those two kind of learnings, or one of the learnings and repetition, can you say that maybe adding 2 more repetitions periods help long-term retention?
Yep.
Or
Absolutely.
so there is not like, adding 1, 2, 3 doesn't make any difference, only when you go to like real, I don't know, 10 or 15 repetitions between these 2 sessions. The more you add, the better it performs. Is that correct?
So adding 2 or 3 would definitely make a big difference. At some point, it will plateau off. So at some point, you're getting diminishing returns.
Mm-hmm.
So when is that point will depend on the learner and the material. In general, one of the big theories for why spacing is so effective is because what it does is it actually is almost a covert retrieval. So even better if it's an active retrieval where you're putting it in, you're trying to recall it from memory. But if you see something, between, you say you learn something the first time, you give it a bit of time and you come back to it a second time. That second time is going to feel a little rustier. It's going to feel a little bit more difficult. You're going to come back to it with fresher eyes. So as long as you're getting some of that benefit from seeing it, that's where the benefit comes from, where you're getting reminded of something that kind of faded away from your accessible memory. You're seeing it or processing it in a slightly different way. So you're adding something new to it. That's when that repetition will do something.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you see something and it's the 20th time in a week, because it's constantly fresh on your mind, now that like 19th time, the 20th time is really going to feel like nothing. There's going to be no sense of difficulty. It's going to be, boring, same old, same old. This already feels really easy. And I'm not even processing it deeply and thinking about it in a different way because I feel like I've already seen it too many times.
Yeah.
That's when your brain is turned off. So that 19th, that 20th time is actually not going to add very much.
Mm-hmm.
So it really goes back to that feeling of difficulty, that when it feels difficult and more challenging or more rusty, that's where you're getting the biggest benefits. Which is kind of a weird thing, right? Because it means that throughout the whole learning process, you need to be chasing that feeling of discomfort. And the best way of really checking if you do or don't know something is not just to reread it, but it's to try to recall it for yourself.
Yeah.
So if that fifth recall still feels a little tricky, keep doing it. Do it another time. But if then that seventh recall feels really easy, you can either put it aside for a while, maybe wait even longer, maybe come back to it a month later. Just give yourself a 6-month check-in. We want to keep giving ourselves these long check-ins for things that are really important.
Yeah. Okay.
But the check-in is, how difficult does this feel?
Okay, so we covered retrieval practice, space practice. Can you talk a bit about interleaving practice?
Oh, interleaving is my baby. This is where I've done the vast majority of my research on effective study strategies. Interleaving is such an interesting one because it is so counterintuitive. Now, what do I mean by interleaving? Let's say you're sitting in math class and you're trying to learn different formulae. So maybe it's a stats class. You're trying to learn different types of statistical tests that are appropriate for different types of research designs. The way our textbooks teach things is very one at a time. And then the way we oftentimes practice and revise or study for our exams is very one thing at a time. We'll just do, so in a psychological stats class, it'd be like, oh, let me calculate z-scores, and then let me calculate one sample t, and then dependent t, and then independent t, and then ANOVA. You'll have these different tests that build up as research designs get more and more complicated. And people do one thing at a time a lot of the times, most of the time. And it feels really obvious to do one thing at a time because it feels organized. You feel like you're building up your learning. We see this not just in math class, but we see this in any other class. And we also see this in sports practice, that you'll have coaches you create drills for their team where they're just doing the same thing over and over and over again. So maybe standing at the free throw line and just shooting 100 hoops, throwing it 100 times, standing from the same place, trying to make sure you're locking in that free throw. This is everywhere in our coaching, our education system, our self-study strategies. But what the research shows is that actually, when you have these different skills, these different concepts, rather than doing only one thing at a time, it can actually be a lot better to mix up the practice. Now, this
Can you give an example?
Counterintuitive. So with the basketball example, rather than just standing at the free throw line, move around. like throw the ball from all different points of the court and keep mixing that up instead of standing in one place and doing that 100 times in a row.
Hmm.
Or in that stats class, after you've learned had the lectures, when you're doing your homework, rather than just doing, or when you're practicing to prepare for the exam, rather than doing just one type of thing at a time, take all the questions that you have and have them mixed up, presented in a mixed up order.
Is there so when we talk about the same, like practicing the same concept in math, I guess it makes a lot of sense because there is some kind of formula to use for this specific problem. If you keep on doing those kind of problems, you do the same thing, and you should interleave different kind of methods to solve problems. What about more content heavy subjects like anatomy, physiology, and all these let's say health sciences, for example, when I'm not exactly sure which is one concept really, because you might, so how do you view those specific areas?
So this goes to this requires me thinking about why is mixing things up important for learning, right? So we have to like whittle it down to what are the underlying processes, and then we can think about where are the places where this is going to be most effective. Now, there are two broad categories of processes that interleaving supports. The first one is it drives your attention to different things. So if you are going and you're practicing different math concepts, math formula, and you're mixing up the order, by having different problems next to each other, it's drawing your attention to what are the key differences between them.
Mm.
So now let's think about content courses. Are there things that become really important to highlight to students? So for example, if you're learning about history is something that people often teach one event at a time, but we can also see across different events in our history from different parts of the world, there might be certain similar features that are shared across what otherwise might look like very different events. So thinking about, uprising or changing of regimes or governance throughout history.
Hmm.
What happens? What are the different things that lead to mass uprisings or protests? What are the situations that lead to economic collapse? If we just focus on one event at a time, which is often how we teach history, we may not have our attention drawn to those parallels because we're so focused on just this one event.
So,
But if we're learning history in a mixed up way, we'd be more likely to notice those connections and those similarities, as well as the key differences.
so almost like we do interleaving practice in order to find the differences in each phenomenon to strengthen our understanding of the individual phenomena.
Yeah. So, because with the math example, the statistics example, one thing that I noticed when I was teaching statistics is that students would try to brute force memorize like 20 different formulae. And the first thing you see them do when they come to the exam is they write all the formulae down at the top of the first page so they have it there as their little cheat sheet. But that doesn't always help them because the problem now is I can remember all the formulae, but I don't know when to use each one. So much of our lives, it's not just a matter of how much information do I have stuffed into my head, but do I know when to use each thing? When does one concept apply versus another concept? And if we're just doing one thing at a time, then we never end up practicing that skill of trying to figure out what to apply in what situations. And we never really know we never end up paying attention to what things become confusing.
Mm-hmm.
So that interleave practice really helps to drive attention to, oh, I didn't realize this would be a place where I could be confused.
Mm-hmm.
Or I didn't notice that there are actually these deeper structural features that are critical for me to pay attention to that help me differentiate between them or recognize the commonalities. So thinking about what it is that you want to teach your students, that then should drive the way in which you sequence the different examples, sequence the lessons, sequence the practice.
And how do you like you mentioned spacing, that you come back to it like a year later. There is a really nice chart like about the forgetting curve, when what it says is that you learn something and then you're about to forget it within a couple of, say, days. And they say that the right time to hit that information again or hit that practice again is right before you would forget it. How do
Yes.
you view, like, it's just that like that would be like the best ever, but also if you hit that information again when you completely forgot it, does that help again? Does that restart your learning phase and you have to do the space repetition again? Or does it also already even though you had no idea about that information again, it still works as space practice?
Yes to both things. It even if you come back to it, it's too long and you've forgotten it, you're not able to be successful, because you're seeing it again, that is still going to be helpful. And it's not like you're starting again.
Mm.
Once we learn something, it's never going to be starting again, which is the nice thing. But of course, it is also better to get it right as you're going to forget it, because that will be most optimal.
Yes.
So yes, spacing is going to lead to benefits regardless, but then you can think about within that, how can we optimize it? So let me share with you what I do for my undergraduate class. My class, I teach this class on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so it's twice a week for 90 minutes. My Tuesdays, I do very well, actually before Tuesdays. So every Monday they have a quiz that's due. And they're supposed to do reading before that. And there's questions in that quiz that at least get them to think about the content that they're about to learn, even if they never really properly read. They have to at least activate some of their prior knowledge. So the first time they really somewhat think about the content is when they're doing that quiz, probably on Monday, the night before the exam, before the lecture, because that's the due date. Then they come to lecture, and there's a little bit of preparation now in their head because they've already started thinking about the content and they had to write a little thing about it. They receive that lecture, and in that lecture, I try to make it as interactive as possible. And then that's on Tuesday. So Tuesday would consider the real first true exposure to the content. On Thursday, so 48 hours later, they come back and they now have to do group work where I have these different activities where they have to apply what they learned on Tuesday. So now the content is being represented. It's only a 2-day gap, but it looks somewhat different, and it's now they have to be the ones that are more active. The answers will never be found in the lecture slides. They actually have to practice applying it. Then on the next week's lecture on that is due the next Monday, they'll have questions from that week, but also everything before. So my weekly quizzes are cumulative.
Yeah.
So they have a spacing of 2 days and then about 5 days. But then because it keeps coming back on future quizzes, the spacing might then be a week and then 2 weeks. And then maybe I'll skip a few quizzes and then put it again, 3 quizzes from then.
It's so great that you mentioned that, because a couple of weeks before I had a chance to talk with Cindy Niebel, and when I asked her, like, give educators one takeaway how to put this into practice, and what she said is cumulative quizzes throughout the semester.
So cumulative quizzes, absolutely something that I do. And then I also make sure that it's following that forgetting curve diagram that you talked about, where when it's newer information, it's shorter spacing. And then as they practice it up and get more familiar, I can gradually increase the amount of spacing.
Yeah, sounds amazing. So maybe moving on to some other barriers you see why these methods were not, or first, do you agree with the fact that these methods that we were talking about are still not widely spread amongst education and amongst students' behavior and student study methods?
Yes and no. So back when I was in college, things like Quizlet and Memrise or Vuvo, they didn't exist. There was really no good way of engaging in retrieval practice. What I see in my undergrads now is that they do a lot of retrieval practice, but the question is, are they doing the right kind of retrieval practice? So I'll have students who say, I did a lot of quizzing. I quizzed myself. I used flashcards. And I'll say, okay, show me your flashcards. And I'll look at the flashcards that they make. And essentially what they often do is they take what's in my lecture slide and they'll like write a concept term on one side and they'll write the definition on the other side. Or I saw once a really, really awful example where they just took these bullet points that I had on my slide and they chopped the bullet point like phrase randomly in half and put the first half of the bullet point on one side and the second half of the bullet point on the other side. So they were technically doing retrieval practice, but they were not doing retrieval practice at the right level of Bloom's taxonomy, at the right level of how I wanted them to use it. Because my questions are all very, very applied, where I will, write a scenario and get them to evaluate it and assess it in terms of the concepts that we learned and create suggestions for how to address different things. They're not practicing that piece. So when you say our people aren't using it, a lot of them are now using retrieval practice, but maybe not optimal. For teachers, a lot of times you may not be creating a lot of retrieval practice opportunities because sometimes it's really hard to come up with good exam questions.
Yeah.
I've come up with some exam questions. I want to keep them for secret from my exam so I don't ruin them and lose that to the broader outside world. However, technology can also help with that. Generative AI, for example, can help with creating good questions. And this, I think, this is a new thing where now, even for students, this will help them, because rather than having to write their own and not knowing how to create good questions, they could probably put in prompts. Here are some example questions that the teacher creates. Create similar style ones that will test me on applying the knowledge. So I think there are ways in which we can do it, but the barrier. So what are the barriers? One barrier is maybe people don't know about it, but I think a lot of people do in fact know about the benefits of retrieval practice. The second barrier might be that back in the day, maybe less so now, we don't have good access to creating these practice questions. Again, this is where technology really helps with that. But just because people know it's effective and they have the resources to engage it still doesn't mean that they're going to do it. A lot of teachers have created these wonderful resources for their students just to find that on the learning management system, they can see that their students have never opened it. And so there are other barriers we have to think about. One is that people might not see value in it. They might know, yeah, I know it's generally good for learning, but I don't need it because I'm already doing well on my exams.
And just to build on that, when we think about the assessment, if I'm getting assessed on a single exam in, I don't know, at the end of the semester, it might not just be the fact that it doesn't bring value to me. It might really does not bring value to me because it might be easier to cram, like literally, it might. But yeah, I do see that a lot. That it does not, especially when I was in school as well. It didn't necessarily help me that I did these methods, especially those on harder courses, and those who crammed, or those who just, I don't know, studied the leaked practice exam questions might have done similarly or better even. And you really have to be extremely motivated to actively engage with these methods.
Right. And I will talk to a lot of students. They'll go, of course I want to learn. I have a lot of students in my class who are pre-service teachers. So they have this broader long-term value that, this is going to be useful for me when I'm leading my own class. But the short term is that they're taking 5 different classes. Here at university, in a public university in America, many of them are also working other jobs. They also are doing internships or research positions, or they're involved in student organizations. It comes back to time being the limiting factor. Even if they in generally know it's good, they might say that given my crazy life right now and how busy I am, there's not an immediate incentive for me to engage in retrieval practice on my own, because I'm doing just fine in my class. Yeah. So one of the big things that I think about is how can teachers build this into their class time? When my students are in my classroom, that's time that they have put aside that is protected to study content for my class. And so I often feel like if I only lecture in my class, that's kind of wasting their time. I would love them to actually practice and do retrieval practice in my classroom, knowing that it might be hard to be incentivized to build that into their out of class time. So that's one of the things that I tried to do, is knowing that they have crazy busy lives and their incentive is not always to learn information deeply. How can I build that into my classroom? The second thing is that it feels difficult and it feels uncomfortable, especially the first few times you try to retrieve newly learned content. A lot of times you might fail to retrieve all the correct information. This leads to a feeling of discomfort because people don't like to experience difficulty or challenge or failure, even if it's not public, even if the professor didn't ever see this, you don't like to show it to yourself.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we have to figure out is how can we reduce or attenuate that experience and that emotional cost of retrieval practice. So one thing to do this is stop making them look like tests.
Yeah.
Can we think about retrieval practice in our classroom or and model it for them as something they can use in their own learning that can feel more fun, that can feel more engaging? Maybe this is doing some kind of retrieval practice activity together with your classmates that you feel comfortable with. Maybe this is making it into something that feels a little bit more like a game. Maybe this is doing giving some kind of message or structuring some culture in your classroom first about how learning is a process and you're not supposed to do well the first time. That if you're getting a lot of things wrong, that's exactly where you're supposed to be at the beginning. And the real satisfaction is seeing that growth over time.
Yeah, and also when you were talking about like when we do make mistakes, it does not feel really good. And that I just want to bring back passive and active recall here because one of the big things when I read your studies and papers, one of the big things that I noticed there, which I haven't before, is that passive recall is also like just really like stress free. Like you just read the things again, you read the lecture slides again, you listen to the lecture again, and you don't spot your weak areas, which is just so I don't know rewarding in a way. Like I feel like okay, I know everything about the anatomy of the leg now because I just listened to the lecture again. But in the same time, if you would have like examined yourself or did the quizzes, you would find those weak areas that you had, which is just not really good to face before 2 weeks before the final exam. All right, so
Yes.
and that really resonated with me because I did remember me studying in med school and actually like I don't know watching some videos while I was cooking and okay now I did repetition of let's say ear anatomy or something. So yeah.
Yeah, the passive strategies, they can lead to what we call an illusion of learning.
Hmm.
You feel like you're being very productive. You're like, whoa, I watched 10 videos. Like, look at all the words that went past my ears. It can feel productive. Same thing with a lot of times people, when they do note taking, they
Yeah.
do it with open book, right? They do it. So they're basically just copying things from one page to another. That can feel productive because at the end of it, you look and like, wow, look at this, like all these pages that I filled with different colored markers. And yet, so it can feel good and we can think we're learning. And yet often because we're not processing the content in a deeper way, all that feeling is an illusion.
Yeah.
And you don't want, the worst thing is to feel like you're super confident going into an exam, you feel comfortable, and then in the exam you can't remember it. Or in the future when you realize you need to use this content and now you're forced to go back and relearn it, which feels like, not efficient. Or you feel like you forgot it all, which also doesn't feel good. But yeah, in the moment, rereading passive study can feel better, but it also then can increase challenges later on. So what you said is that you don't want to have this feeling like right before it, in the week before when you're studying for the exam. And so this is also the importance of building retrieval practice frequent and early. So do this retrieval practice very far away when you're not even thinking about the exam. And what research has actually shown, and out of a group of researchers in London, they did a meta-analysis looking at the effect of frequent retrieval practice in classrooms on test anxiety. They find that having those frequent retrieval practices actually reduce anxiety when it comes to those final exams. So that's another way to think about it. Yes, in the moment, passive study can feel good, but you're going to end up being a lot more anxious and doing worse in the final exam.
Mhm.
But if you build retrieval practice in early, that's going to actually build your confidence, because going into the final exam, you're going to realize you've retained a lot more than you would have otherwise. And you have, during your revision period, far less that you feel like you need to relearn and cram, because you've got it solidly in your head.
Yeah. Can you maybe, like, you mentioned or you talked a bit about those, how to create actually good flashcards or good quizzes, questions that do engage you with retrieval practice. I want to focus a bit on that because I think it's really important, like how answering a question is not basically what I like to call, maybe it's not the right word, like I like to call pattern recognition. Like I remember that this word was in the right answer like a couple of errors before, and then it doesn't really help me to remember or retrieve information from my memory. I just or retrieve information from memory, but not the one that I need, not the knowledge, but rather just things I remember. So first, I want to tell you how I did it when I was in medical school, and I want to give feedback, like how do you think that is good, and then I want to ask like what is the optimal way to do it. What I did a lot is when like there was a lot of content, and I really did not have the time to turn lecture slides into good practice questions or good flashcards. So what I did is that usually these practice slides had like a good title, like very very easy example, like maybe the citric cycle. And then there was like maybe a couple of information about this. So what I did is that I put on the question side the title of the slide, and on the answer side I put the actual slide. So it would not make sense to anyone other than me, but I could recall all of the information in that in my head, like, okay, yes, I know, yeah, that was that, and then yeah, it makes sense. And then I check, oh yeah, I missed that one, I should do it again. So I really felt like I'm engaging in retrieval practice, even though it's not like a real question. Like it didn't ask me what was the specific enzyme of this reaction. So how do you think that is that
That's
resonates with?
absolutely retrieval practice. Retrieval practice is anything you do to recall information from your own memory without looking at the answers.
Yeah,
So it doesn't have to look like a question. It doesn't have to look like a test. It doesn't have to look like an exam. Retrieval practice is also things you can do where, you're reading the news and you're like, this relates to something that I learned in school. Let me like actually now think about how that explicitly connects. There was no question there, but you're still engaging in retrieval
yeah,
practice. So I think that is absolutely a great way, especially when you don't have good questions available to you, to even just look at slide headings or subheadings of a chapter and try to write down the things you know. But I do want to challenge you and say we can go a little bit further than that, because what you're doing is you're focusing on the details of what is on the slide, but you can also create you can almost imagine another stack of flashcards. Come up with examples, or you can like randomly grab two flashcards and try to connect them.
yeah,
Those also be different ways of engaging in retrieval practice, but it's about accessing the knowledge and using and applying the knowledge in different ways. So I think that'd be a great way to think about flashcards is not just what's on the other side, but how can I use them in more flexible ways? Pick two, find a connection. Um, Pick one and come up with a real life example. Think about or open the newspaper and find things that are related to the things that you've been learning in class, or if you're a medical student, watch an episode of House
yeah.
or Grey's Anatomy and try to like pause it before they tell you what's happening based on the symptomology. What do you think it is? All of those would be different ways of engaging retrieval practice.
Mhm. And when we talk about, because again, as an educator, one of the best ways when you're not in class is actually like how you do it is like quiz students. That's probably the one of the easiest way to get students to use retrieval practice. What is a good quiz? What do you like? What questions do you ask yourself when you write a quiz that it's actually like this is right? This is going to engage a retrieval practice, even though they are like it's open book or something, it still engages them with retrieval practice.
So I'm going to respond with a question. What is your learning objective?
Mm.
The answer to what is a good quiz depends on what is the learning objective that you have. Is your learning objective to pass the medical board exams, in which case you know that the questions look a certain way? And then the best way to quiz yourself is to try to match that as much as possible. But maybe your learning objective is not just to pass the medical boards, but to be a good doctor and to be able to like diagnose cases and think about differential diagnoses. In that case, the good quiz would be having like a patient case and then trying to come up with all the different things that are related to different types of symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
So if that was your learning objective, then maybe starting with symptomology and patient history would be the type of question that you would want to ask, and then writing down all the different things.
One of the things that I've seen educators struggle with, even though if they came up with really good practice questions that actually, were challenging and needed retrieval practice, the amount of content you can cover in quizzes is almost like, I'll bring an example. When you do a test of a student, it's quite easy to do because you don't have to test them on every single information. Because you can just, like, I don't know, they answer 10x out of all the 100x information, and then you say you got 9 out of 10 there, then you have 90% of the whole content known. But when you do retrieval practice, you do quizzes, the questions you ask are the content or the knowledge that the students will try to retrieve. And those that you didn't ask for, those will be left behind and have not engaged with retrieval practice. So how do you view that when in your own classroom, for example?
So
Did that make sense, first of all?
I'll give you, that makes sense. I'll give you an example from my classroom, but also I'll give you an example from medical school. So you can think then about how can I make my questions very efficient in hitting lots of different concepts. So a patient, 55-year-old man presents at the clinic with a persistent cough and blah, blah, blah. What could be going? Like what are going to be the questions that you ask? What are the first tests? And then what could be the different options? What are the options running through your head? This one case example of this patient, that can now spark off a lot of different things. So in that one question, you can end up retrieving things about protocols, like intake questions and protocols. You can now think about, a persistent cough, is that a respiratory thing? Is that something else? Like, what are all the different things that get connected to coughs, which is many, many different systems, right? It's a very generic kind of, or maybe you add a different symptom. He's also been experiencing chronic fatigue in certain ways, or then you ask questions if there's trigger. You now can actually end up in this one question exploring a lot of different concepts.
Mm-hmm.
The way I do this in my class, the class is called Human Learning Cognition Motivation. Oh man, I can't believe I'm messing up the name of my class. It's Cognition, Human Learning, and Motivation. And so we start with talking about cognitive load theory and attention, then we move on to long-term memory and desirable difficulties for learning. We move on to expertise. We talk about all these different things. We talk about motivation. We talk about self-regulated learning. One of the questions I'll ask is, what are all the ways in which we touched upon difficulty in this class? And every single, like almost every single lecture has something that you can think about how it's related to difficulty. So in that one question, they're having to integrate and really draw upon different ideas. So that will not be a good exam question because it'll be really hard to grade, but it's a really good practice question to engage that retrieval.
Yeah, I think it's really important to make a difference between test and practice questions because they are not the same. And this was like a huge, like, I think it's not trivial, for example, first, like that you shouldn't use test questions to practice. But when I first understood it is when I was like learning about some diseases, and then what the test question is like, what is not a symptom of? And then I used that, and then when I had to, like, actually someone asked me like, what are the symptoms of? and I couldn't
Mhm.
name it. Like I only could name the one that is not, if that makes sense. Like, and then I asked this, okay, this is not how I should study. I shouldn't do just like, it's almost like it feels like I'm studying because I'm doing a retrieval practice, I'm doing the things that needed, but the content is not right because it doesn't help me to get a good understanding of the topic, if that makes sense. So that's when I
No, so yeah,
realized,
let's use that example. What is not a symptom of, and then you have the list of different symptoms.
yeah,
What you could have done during your practice is also think about what, like, not just which is the correct answer, but why the other answers are incorrect. Oh, but
exactly,
this would be a symptom of this. So this is a place where it's really interesting because people generally, a lot of instructors think, oh, multiple choice tests are just bad tests. That multiple choice tests, all you need to do is recognize the answer. And so if it's a summative exam, maybe multiple choice tests don't feel as if they could get as deep as open-ended questions. But on a practice test, what a multiple choice test could do is it could give you 4 in 1. So if you have 4 options, now instead of just focusing on what the correct answer is, if students switch their thinking and think about this, not just can I get the right answer, but also let me think through all the other options and why they're incorrect and what they are related to, then you can now get a lot more bang for your buck out of that one question.
exactly, yeah. Um, okay, now we talked a bit already about how to put these methods into practice, but what would be your one or two advice for educators who are, especially in like, let's say, higher education, who want to use these methods in their own classes? And just to make it easier, let's say these classes are, because I think there's a whole lot of differences between subject areas. Let's say these classes are in health science. What are the best ways to engage students with these, to get them to use these methods?
So just sitting in a long lecture where you do nothing but listen to the professor talk, that's kind of boring and attention will fade in and out. So one thing is actually building in these different activities and opportunities for practice in your class will make the class more engaging and keep students paying attention for far longer and get them to actually think about it deeper. So one of the things that I always do is instead of as I always start my class with retrieval practice. What were some of the most important things we learned last week? And I do this with like a poll everywhere type of system where people just type in their answers and you can see it build up. Um, I'm getting them to start with retrieval practice and then creating different breaks throughout. So maybe one example would be, so now that we learned about thinking about difficulty in this way, can you guys tell me, like, everyone write down how this is connected to something that we learned 2 weeks ago?
Hmm.
So doing little retrieval practice all throughout, getting them to try to guess the results of a study or guess why did some pattern happen this way. Like, so maybe with a health science example, I'm not super familiar with health sciences, but you know, instead of just teaching about a particular pathway, um, if they have a little bit of background knowledge, be like, then we did this. There's this change, and why does aspirin help?
Mm,
And then forcing them to, instead of telling them aspirin helps because of this, forcing them to actually try to generate what could be the answer. So building these things, and the other thing I want to say is, especially for higher education instructors, a lot of people who are university professors, we tend to think, oh, our students are adults. They're 18 years old. They're adults. Like, they should be independent and in charge of their own learning.
yeah.
Now, 18-year-olds are really not all that different from 17-year-olds. um, and university is the first time in one, for a lot of them, the first time where they truly have to be independent. And a lot of students struggle with that. And so even though your students are adults, I build a lot of things into my undergraduate classes to try to teach them and support self-regulated learning. Um, Self-regulated learning is a real challenge. It used to be that they were in school from, I don't know, like 8 to 3, and they had their periods and everything was very, very structured. In university, they have a lot of empty gaps in their day or throughout the week. Think like every day is a slightly different schedule. From semester to semester, it might be a different schedule. Even from week to week is a different schedule. That building up habits is even more challenging in the university situation than it was in the high school situation. And so they're knowing that these are young adults for the first time in this situation. Yes, they're adults, but I actually think it's really important to teach and support self-regulated learning. So I'll talk about habits. I'll create incentives into the structure of my course. I'll model and I'll give them examples of how they could practice retrieval practice in the classroom. They're doing it in my classroom. And then I'll explicitly say, this is something you can do on your own. Here's how you can do it on your own. Now go and try to do it on your own.
Hmm.
But they're not going to do it on their own if they never had proof of it working in the classroom or
Yeah.
feeling like I can even try to engage and try to retrieve.
And
So yeah, it's important for even higher education teachers to really think about supporting that self-regulated learning in our students.
and when you said like one thing stuck with me again, you said incentivize this kind of methodology. So do you think the teachers may be able to change their grading somehow, or the way they assess students in order to facilitate using these methods, or is
Yeah,
that something that you do as well?
so retrieval practice doesn't have to mean lots of high stakes assessments, right? It could be done in low stakes or no stakes ways. So I'll do my quizzes are low stakes. They're not no stakes, but they're low stakes. And they're not worth a huge amount of your total grade, but that does incentivize them to at least, try. But then I'll
Yeah.
have lots of in-class activities that are not graded at all. But because they're in class and there's the social pressure and I'll call
Mm.
on them, that's enough incentive for them to engage in the retrieval practice because they have to have something reasonable to say. Um, like either when I pull up their stuff or when I directly call on them. So then those are things where I didn't have to change my grading structure, but I did have to change the structure of how I use my classroom time.
Yeah. But like again, the idea is to get them to use these methods, and if it's social pressure or is it low stake quizzes, but somehow you just have to get them to use these methods. What I've seen is that just by giving them tools, I think we mentioned this a bit before, that I don't think every student who knows about retrieval practice and who knows about tools to make easy flashcards are using them, exactly for the reasons that we mentioned before. So I've seen a lot of educators struggle with this, that they were like, all the methods are there, why aren't they using them? And students just needed some like um, an intuition to do so. And an intuition could be an incentive, and intuition could be your own self internal motivation to remember stuff longer, but it's not the same for everyone. So yeah, do you have any last ideas to share, things that we weren't able to touch on?
I think the thing that I've been thinking about these days is our students, or just learners in general, right? We're all lifelong learners. We all have very full lives. We all have different goals. And so it's the thing I really been thinking about is how can I, as an instructor, where I want them to learn the important things from my class, how can I still acknowledge, respect, and accommodate that people are in my class with very different other things going on in their lives, with very different time demands, with very different goals. How can I make sure that I'm not just assuming that everyone's goal must be the same, is to master every single thing in my class at 100%. So when I think about self-regulated learning, it's no longer now just about how do I force people to use retrieval practice and do it in a spaced and unique way, but how can I help them make better decisions for themselves that will be aligned with their goals? That if their goal is, you know what, like this class is simply just not important to me, but I have these other things that are, okay, let me like help you know enough so you can apply that to those classes.
Yeah,
Um, so I
that's
don't know. I don't know. I'm just, yeah, I think the big thing is seeing them and recognizing the context of their lives.
Well, thank you so much for all the amazing ideas you shared today. And I really enjoyed our conversation. So again, thanks so much, Veronica. And I hope that listeners, educators could take a lot of great practices home that they can apply. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.